Hi, welcome everybody to this panel discussion exploring the ritual of great team meetings. Our panelists today are Wade Foster, co-founder and CEO of Zapier. Wave, hi Wade, and Claire Hughes Johnson, the corporate officer and advisor at Stripe. And John Zeratsky, he's the author and co-founding general partner at Character. So I'm your moderator today. My name is Elise Keith. I'm the founder and CEO of Lucid Meetings, where we make it easy for teams to run successful meetings every day. And I couldn't be more thrilled to hear from these leaders about their meetings, because in case you haven't noticed yet, meetings are where the action is. It's in meetings where you are going to be setting your company's strategy and figuring out how to execute on it. It's in meetings where all of those diverse perspectives that you've assembled on your team get included. And it's in meetings where you have those conversations that either advance the well-being of your team, as Ariana was just talking about, or you don't. Because the reality is, we often fail to do those things well because meetings are hard. They're tricky. They're really challenging to get right. So when a team does get it right, when they've done the design and the trial and the error and the testing to find the way, the how-to for success, it often becomes a company ritual. So we are talking today about some successful rituals that each of these leaders have developed and that they've built into their company to drive their culture and make work go. So we're going to start there with your stories. And I want to hear about the problems you faced and how the rituals that you invented came to be. Now, if you're watching along, if you can capture your questions in the attendee doc, we'll catch those as we go. And let's just learn how to make meetings go great. So let's start with you, Wade. When you were at Zapier, what is the ritual that you developed for your team, and what problem did it solve? How did it come to be?
Yeah, so we've been a distributed team since day one, and one of the things we noticed, first, we were predisposed to liking written culture, asynchronous working environment, but there are times when we needed that synchronous time to work. And at first, when we started doing like staff meetings, our weekly staff meeting, we'd show up, we'd share what we're working on, and as a result, it kind of ended up being just status updates. And so rather than actually having time to collaborate to resolve some of the critical issues that we were facing, we spent time talking at each other. Here's my status update on X. Here's my status update on Y. Here's my status update on Z. And by the time the scheduled meeting time was over, all we'd done was shared information. And so we found that meetings were just a poor mechanism to do status updates. In fact, the better way to do status updates is through a written material that can be consumed at any point in time. And so we shifted how we thought about our meetings and shifted towards a document first, writing first setup. So the way it works is we have a set of prompts that are associated with updates that we want. And so before this meeting, folks come in and write all their updates that are associated with those things. There is no pre-read required, though. People show up to the meeting, and for the first 15 minutes, we read through all of the updates. We comment off to the sidebar. And so a lot of the small issues that are faced in the day-to-day running of a company are resolved in those comment section. So we don't have to spend any time discussing, collaborating on that type of thing. Then we can save the bulk of the meeting, the next 45, 50 minutes, for one or two key topics where we really need the power of discussion and collaboration to happen. And so that's the core, I think, ritual that we've developed around our meetings at Zapier.
That's super interesting. And it's not too dissimilar from a ritual I know they use at Coda, the Dory and the Pulse, where there are written information sent in advance, and there are mechanisms for getting that out in front of people. And a great use of both the bringing remote people together. So Claire, I'm interested to hear from you. What's the ritual that you developed, and was it designed to solve a similar problem, or were you looking at for something else?
Not a similar problem, though I definitely agree with Wade on that challenge. I think the best ritual that I have, which I very much stole with pride, which I'll tell the story of, is just having a check-in and check-out. You can find out more about it in my Coda toolkit on offsites, but you don't need to just do a check-in and check-out for offsites. I think for certain meetings, it makes sense. And backing up, my theory behind it is meetings are collections of people. And if you don't get to know those people and have them get to know each other, it's not going to be a great meeting because you don't have the key ingredients really grounded and on the same page about each other and about how they work together. And so there's a lot of work you can do to help that team if it is form. But one thing you can do, even if everybody has not had all their relationships built, is just do a quick check-in, personal and professional, at the start of a meeting. How are you feeling? What do you want to talk about today? And a quick check out at the end. How do you feel in one word? Just to get everybody participating, but also for people to understand folks' state of mind, or it's a chance to even share, hey, I was up all night with my baby who's sick, and forgive me if I'm not on my game. And I think that just creates that connection for the people in the room, so they're not just in a tactical mode.
That's great. And from a research perspective, if anybody else out there isn't doing check-ins or checkouts or something like that, add it now, because it is actually proven to improve your teamwork, your collaboration, and the results of your meetings. So, John, I'm curious to hear from you. I think your ritual is not a little building block, right? Yours is a whole big methodology. Talk about it. Tell us more.
Yeah, I've kind of spent the last 10 years of my career focused on a single type of meeting. And it's a 5-day meeting. So it's kind of crazy to think about it, but it's the design sprint, or the sprint method, that I helped to develop at Google Ventures. And the key idea is that it's really this focused, intentional, inclusive effort for a team to kind of get aligned and oriented at the start of a big project. So when the stakes are really high, when the team wants to make sure that they're on the same page and that they're heading in the right direction, they can run a sprint to surface a bunch of ideas, capture those ideas, and then most importantly, to actually test those ideas with real customers. So before they go in the garage for weeks or months, or spend however much money on execution, they can make sure they're going in the right direction. And I first started working on this ritual, this template, when I first joined Google Ventures, and I joined in the early days of that firm. And one of the big priorities for GV was to essentially build a value add practice, a portfolio support practice. So a way to support the companies that we were investing in addition to just writing a check. And they had recruited a bunch of people from Google, designers, engineers, product managers, marketers, and that included me. And at first, we would just sort of go into the portfolio companies and say, hey, how can we help? Like, what problems are you facing with your product, with your marketing? How can we help you solve those problems? And pretty quickly, we realized that while every company was unique in some ways, there were some really common challenges that were showing up again and again, mostly around kind of the super basic stuff that you face when you're doing something new. Which is, are we building the right thing for the right people? Like, is this effort going to be worth it? Are these resources going to be well spent? And so we thought there was an opportunity to create basically a templatized, repeatable approach to doing that work, and focus not just on being efficient in that work, but in actually fixing some of the common problems that we were seeing with teams. We knew Jake Knapp, who was a designer at Google. He had been running these things he was calling design sprints, kind of the nascent form. So we brought him to Google Ventures. We sort of adopted this process. And over the next 5 years, we ran about 100 of these design sprints with companies in the portfolio. And we were not just focused on the impact that we were having in those sprints, but really on iterating and refining and improving the process itself. So the process today, which I still use all the time, is really the result of literally hundreds and hundreds of iterations and refinements with a huge number of companies.
So that's really a fascinating insight into what it takes to create meeting success, right? You've got these iterations and the design and the planning and templatizing it. You've got a process and you follow it. And there are so many people who are very, very resistant to the idea that you should follow a process or a template. which is one of the fatal flaws in meetings. And I think that's where we're going to head now. So what are some of these other misconceptions or flaws that get people into a place where they're resistant to making their meetings better and therefore have lousy meetings? Wade, do you want to tell some of your ideas about what are the tragic flaws here that are getting people?
For sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of common tropes with meetings that are, for whatever reason, we just tend to not pay attention to. One, I mentioned already, used for status updates. Two, lack of agendas. Three, no action items. And as a result, like they kind of have poor design and poor discipline around them. And then I think as organizations grow, there's a lot of inertia around sort of the status quo, that it takes a lot of activation energy for someone to step up and say, hey, we're going to rethink about how we do this, and then build a habit and the discipline to make sure that our meetings improve over time. And so as a result, I think in many companies and many cultures, you kind of just have this sort of laissez-faire attitude towards your meetings that don't tend towards productive meetings.
So Claire, if you were to look at that in your experience at Stripe, introducing something like that check-in, right? Like when you begin with, it can feel kind of artificial and forced. And that's a habit you sort of have to shift the whole organization around. How do you approach that kind of meeting culture change?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just have to be unabashed that you're going to make meetings better. And I agree with Wade. I think that it's very easy to get weirdly lazy about what is actually the most costly thing that your organization is doing, which is spending this time. And in particularly, interestingly, if you're in a very overloaded, high growth, high pressure environment, it feels even harder to do things like add, what might be a personal check-in to a meeting because you have so much to get done. Or frankly, I think, Wade, you were getting at this, you need a lot of work to run a good meeting. And people tend to then use meetings to get work done, right? So they're actually doing the work in the meeting, whether that's reading, stuff off of slides to each other or doing status updates. And so it's to me a combination of setting ownership with the right place for running great meetings and actually doing the pre-work. And then the other is something we do at Stripe that I know happens at Amazon, which is if there is pre-work, and usually there is, Stripe is a little bit more of a written culture also. Say there's a memo, we allocate time to read it at the start of the meeting, as opposed to people sort of being in different stages of preparedness. And that enforces a norm of we're going to help you be prepared by giving you some time to prepare at the beginning of the meeting so we can run a productive meeting. And I think you have to, in this case, Elise, I think there's a lot of good bottoms up things that happen in companies, but I think leaders need to set the example by making changes with how they run meetings. Is the shorter answer to your question.
No, that's a great insight. If you're going to ask for a result, why not budget time for people to give it to you?
Yeah.
Right. So, John, Wade, any other thoughts that you want to contribute here on that pull between top down, bottom up, and productivity, work in the meeting? Wade, I see you had some thoughts on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one other thing that is important to remember, and Claire started to get at this as well too, especially in a distributed environment. One of the, I think, blessings of distributed work and remote work that we've all experienced over the last 18 months, but certainly we've been at for a decade at Zapier, is that distributed work is more productive, but it's better for productivity, but not as good for relationships. And so for better or worse, the meeting is the one place where you literally get FaceTime. You get to see each other. And so I think it is really important to take time to carve out mechanisms that allow people to see the humanity in the work. So, because without that, distributed work very much becomes task doing. It's what's the status update on this? Did this task get done? Are you doing this next? Are you doing that next? Which is an important part of work. It is work after all. But without it, but if you focus too much on that, it becomes like a hamster wheel, and it just sort of feels like I'm stuck in this cog. And so it's useful to carve out some space for your meetings to have a little bit of that personal get together. So in our meetings, we do two things. We have the personal milestone and a professional milestone. So people get a chance to celebrate what has happened for the last week. And then also we have an icebreaker question at the top of all of them. And they're kind of silly questions, honestly, a bit cheesy, but they're fun. This week, the question was, are you do your friends and family know you for making a particular dish? And so people shared like the things that they're best at making. And I'm sure at some offsite we'll pull out these dishes at some point in time. And it's a small thing, but it helps us get to know each other better because we don't have those moments in the cafeteria or in the office in the hallway where you sort of forge those bonds and relationships. So I do think for distributed teams in particular, making sure to add in some component of this, even though it might feel like it's time intensive or costly, it actually I think is better over the long haul because it helps build trust and relationships in a team.
That's a totally fun icebreaker question. So for you panelists and for everybody in the chat, if you have a favorite dish that you are known for, like this is the opportunity for the Coda recipe book to come together in real time, which would be totally cool. But John, they're talking about the importance of using meeting time to create relationships. And you have all of this experience with design sprints, which is very much a worky product oriented meeting. And yet, don't you find that that's also where the relationships really come together?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that I have sort of a different perspective on this, which is, sprints really are meetings to do work. They're like none of the normal meeting stuff. They're like none of the status update, like let's make this decision, let's talk about this thing. But they're instead a lot of the work that I think normally and perhaps even ideally would happen in a distributed asynchronous way, and then people would come together. But I think that there's sometimes you just need a forcing function. Sometimes you really just need a deadline and dates on the calendar and space to say, hey, we've been having a million meetings about this project and we know it's a priority. We're going to get the whole team together and we're just going to create space to work on it. But the other interesting thing that we've seen is that I actually think that one of the best ways to drive growth and connection between teams, one of the best icebreakers, frankly, is to do work together. It's so much more meaningful when you can actually see the contributions that people bring to the table. You can see their values come through in their work. You can see what they care about. We've actually resisted adding icebreakers, in air quotes, icebreakers to sprints because we find that if we can just get into the work and really get into things that people deeply care about, we get to sort of stronger, deeper connections more quickly.
Yeah, and I can see how in something like a sprint, right, the way in which you come together and the way you explore the space is templatized. So that makes it easier to create those connections and guide people into a productive discussion. Sometimes harder in team meetings. The other thing that's more challenging, though, for the design sprint space and the places where you're really doing strategy and ideation is, overcoming things like groupthink. So if you haven't done those things to create individual perspective up front, how do you do that? What are some of your tips, John?
Yeah, this is a huge priority for the design sprint. And, I mentioned that when we started to kind of work on this process and create this process, we not only wanted to work more efficiently, but we wanted to kind of fix a lot of the problems that we saw. And a classic problem that shows up again and again in all kinds of organizations, even really well-meaning organizations, is that you don't create equal space for everybody to contribute. You either have, you do brainstorms where you sort of get these like really thin, low quality ideas from everybody, or you send a special team off into their part of the office with closed doors to sort of figure it out, or you end up with groupthink where people sort of get, worked up and excited about an idea that hasn't been sort of pressure tested. And so we do a bunch of stuff in sprints to try to avoid those problems. We do a lot of individual work. We call it working alone together. So we literally, like if it's a remote sprint, we'll say, okay, turn your cameras off for the next 30 minutes and work on paper individually. And then when we come back, everybody's going to share. We have a structured decision-making process that we use where we sort of go through these cycles. It's actually very similar to the Dory and Pulse ritual at Coda, but we go through these cycles where we allow people to individually review and then come back together and share, and then do sort of a forced rank voting, and then rely on our decision maker to make the final call. So I think it's really important, again, to the point about sort of, being intentional about designing your meetings. It's important to know that, these issues around groupthink and around inclusion and around bias are going to crop up unless you're really, really intentional about counteracting them.
So that's a theme that's come up over and over again in your examples, right? Using writing to get the ideas and the diversity out in advance. But sometimes you don't always have time for that. So Claire, do you have any perspective on, brainstorming in time compressed situations?
Oh, I was going to say, I think that, well, sometimes very time compressed situations, I could see doing a time sort of bounded brainstorm just to get everybody's ideas out to then start to prioritize. And I've done that, I think in some sprint format that can really work nicely as long as you make sure everybody participates, to the point about inclusion. The point I was going to make actually is because I think the writing culture versus speaking culture, or decisions you make on how to use meetings and how much writing you do ahead of time, or even to John's point, in the meeting. My view is there's just different meeting types, and being more intentional about what type are you in could solve a lot of these problems. And I think that maybe it's a time bound but unstructured ideation meeting type. At Stripe, the leadership team very intentionally has some longer sessions. Usually we go off-site together, when possible, non-pandemic, and have unstructured time. And that's generally not like there's a lot of written product ahead of time, but it's to really talk at a different level about ideas and about the future. Early on, when I was at Stripe, we went on an off-site trip together and had a long dinner, and then ended up staying up late because I just asked what I thought were some simple questions about some of the drivers of costs and growth in the business and the P&L. And we went and spent like a few hours designing what could the business look like in 5 years from a numbers perspective, but it was really the underlying strategic choices we'd have to make. And interestingly, it looks a lot like it 5 years later. So those moments when you are untime bounded are probably as valuable sometimes as time compressed meetings.
There is something really magic about the serendipity of the right people with ideas seated in a space, maybe with a glass of wine, and where all of the great business happens. So that gets into this question of culture, right? You mentioned there are different types of meetings. We've talked a lot about very specific habits and writing and working together, but every company has all kinds of ways in which that they meet. So how would you describe your overall meeting culture today, and how you create structures in that culture that help you promote your values and drive your business forward across teams? Claire, go ahead and kick us off on this one too, because you already got it started a little bit, but Is there more you would say about Stripe's culture that way?
I would say that it's not consistent. And I think some companies are really rigorous. I don't know, maybe Wade can speak to this, about really consistently approaching meetings across the company in similar ways. Or some companies use frameworks that help them sort of make decisions or problem solve in similar ways. At Stripe, there is some inconsistency, but I think that speaks to the point I was making, which is there are meetings for different purposes, and the meetings that have a more specific let's review these quarterly business results, or let's have a deep dive on a particular team's work, have a lot more structure and a lot more rigor to how they're run. Where there's meeting, even the leadership team, there's a sort of meeting once a week that's longer, that has more structure, some deep dives on common things we discuss, and then a little bit of lack of structure at the end of the agenda so people can bring up timely topics. But we have another meeting later in the week that is very much more of a personal check-in, unstructured meeting, which is sort of top of mind, grab each other. In a physical world, it'd be like you're in a space and you kind of pair off and talk about it. In the Zoom world, we sort of just end early, and people who need to catch each other. But I guess I'd go back to the point I made before, which is making sure everyone understands what type of meeting you're in. Because where inconsistency goes wrong is when there's very different intentions for the time you're spending together, and someone's coming into the meeting and saying, I want these outcomes. And there's no one driving the meeting toward those outcomes, where other people are thinking, let's catch up and generate a few great ideas. And then you just have kind of a real cultural disconnect that starts to undermine productivity, in my opinion. So I think we're kind of inconsistent, structured when we need to be, but we leave time for unstructured sessions. And that seems to be working, though I would say probably if you polled people at Stripe, they'd say we still have too many meetings. And you need to be honest with yourself about why that is.
So Wade, do you want to jump in there? I know you have a way to deter the disruptors of ad hoc too many meetings that are unclear. What's
yeah,
your
I mean,
secret there?
a lot of what Claire shared resonates. You know, I run our exec team, so like that's the place where I sort of have more influence over what the meeting structure looks like. But we don't actually do like a company-wide mandates around it. Different teams have different needs from a meeting perspective, and so we more have, you know, guides and toolkits that help people sort of apply it how they want. And but specific to how like the exec team works, you know, we've got sort of two key meetings, one earlier in the week, one later in the week. And, you know, they serve two different purposes. The one earlier in the week is much more structured, and it's everyone on the team is like working on a set of topics that are shared amongst all of us. That pre-read is really important that I described earlier. Those topics are surfaced in advance. And we make sure to like moderate the discussion around those with a fair amount of structure. So, you know, each topic has a different type of, it's a different type of topic. So we can have some that are called like a dialogue or a discussion topic, which this means, hey, we have a new problem to solve. We don't necessarily have a driver for who's going to actually address this yet. We're actually even trying to identify, is this something that we care about? And so usually we do a round robin around that to identify what are people's needs as it relates to this topic. You know, hey, I think this is a problem and I need this solved in XYZ way for my team or my function or whatever. And, you know, there's a moderator who makes sure to like go person by person to hear everyone's voices and make sure those get surfaced. We've actually set it up so that we have three very active vocal founders that are a part of the team. So in that situation, all three of us are explicitly asked to contribute last to make sure we don't accidentally drown out people's voices. So perhaps we're the biggest, you know, vocal voices in the room too much. So we've tried to self moderate in that way. And then, you know, there's ones that are feedback meetings, which is actually someone's bringing what is supposed to be a pretty close to done solution to a thing. And then we have a blind spot check where it's like, hey, let's go around and make sure, hey, does this actually address the needs that were brought up as part of the discussion and dialogue? And if so, great, good, ship it. If not, okay, maybe we got to do one more cycle on this thing. So we have those different types of meetings or different types of topics that we're spending time on. And that's kind of what happens in that first meeting during the week. And then later in the week, we have what's called a bullpen, which we actually just stole from the Coda team because we liked it so much. But it's the same idea where you get the same group of people together, but the agenda is a lot more loose and informal. And folks will break out into breakout rooms where they'll say, hey, actually, I need this 2 or 3 people to discuss this topic. Or I need, you know, this group to discuss another different type of topic. And that's more so to make sure that there's dedicated space on the calendar to tackle some of that stuff. Because we find on a week-to-week basis, there's often things that emerge that we need time for. But if we haven't sort of set it up in advance, it often ends up being this fire drill where, oh, can someone cancel this meeting and get this on the schedule? We got to get this random assortment of folks together. And it really ends up being quite disruptive to the rest of the company because all of a sudden the exec team is shuffling the deck chairs and it ripples through the whole organization. So by having them bullpen set up, we all know that like, hey, there's a place where we can sort of absorb the stuff that's going to come up in the day-to-day running of a company. And so we find that to be really helpful. And then you pair that with some of these other tools that we've built over time, and you can use those in the bullpen or not use them in the bullpen. And it just sort of helps, you know, get everyone's needs met through like a series of different types of discussions or types of meetings.
I love the bullpen. I'm so glad you guys brought that up and raised that one because, you know, in any effective meeting system, you want every conversation to have a home, right? You have no idea what's going to happen. You have no idea what decisions you need to make or you know, pandemics, hello, right? New plans all the time. And knowing that you have a space to have those conversations is so helpful to keeping things running smoothly. So John, you've talked about sprints, right? And sprints are wicked cool, extra super fun, very productive meetings. And then you have to go run and make the products go. So what does the rest of the meeting culture that goes around a sprint and makes what happens in the sprint become something you can see in the real world come to life?
Yeah, my day-to-day work is running a VC firm where we invest in seed stage startups, and we run various kinds of sprints with them to help them with their product, with their go-to-market, and so there's kind of a different culture and a different cadence that we use in our interactions with our portfolio companies from what we do internally. But there's some consistent elements. The big one is sprints, of course. And so not just the design sprint, but we use a couple different formats. The opportunity sprint, which is really comes upstream of the design sprint. It's about prioritizing, deciding which kind of big problem or opportunity to go after next. There's the brand sprint, which is another framework we developed at GV. There's actually a great brand sprint doc on Coda that Mercy Grace developed. And so, using these sort of different formats when there's a specific problem to solve. The other kind of part of the culture that we use both internally and with our portfolio companies is really structured decision making. So structured evaluation. So, it shows up in a lot of those sprints, but it also shows up for us internally. Anytime we're reviewing a company that we're considering investing, we actually use a scorecard. We have sort of a rubric that we've created, and after we meet with the company and review, the deck and any other materials that they have, before we have a single word of conversation internally, where we might start to construct narratives or let our biases come out, we actually we individually complete this scorecard. So we sit down, we take time individually, we say, okay, how do I think this company scores on the size of the market? Just to use a simple example. And only after we've done that structured process, that individual scorecard, do we come back together and actually talk about what we think as a group. And then finally, the sort of building block or the piece of our meeting culture that shows up internally and also with our portfolio companies is this idea of sort of batch processing. And anybody who's sort of thought deeply about async work or distributed work knows that it's really important to batch process, with email, with various inboxes, with reviewing things, because otherwise you're just getting bombarded at all times by information. But I think a similar principle can actually be really helpful with meetings, because if you sort of you slack your colleague or your partner every single time you have a question or a topic, or you text them or call them, like, it's impossible to get any work done. So internally, we actually have 3 standing check-in meetings per week. So we have one Monday afternoon, one Wednesday afternoon, and one Friday morning. And those are really helpful because when little topics come up, rather than text somebody or Slack them and try to get an answer right away, I just put it on a list to save it for the next check-in. And I think it's important to find the cadence that works right for your team. But for us, this cadence of 3 small check-ins per week, very much like the bullpen, allow us to not be disruptive, to not be fragmented with our time, because we know that before too long, there's going to be sort of a basket to catch those topics, and there's going to be space to talk about them.
Nice. So I heard some similar rhythms coming through in all of those examples. So one of the things I'm curious about actually is, John, you talked about having a mechanism for going through your decision-making process. Do you also log your decisions?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I think that one of the important factors of the decision-making processes that we use in sprints and outside of sprints for our investment process is that there's always an artifact. And this is actually one of the unexpected benefits of running sprints remotely, is that when you're running a sprint in person, you're drawing on a whiteboard, and you hopefully you take pictures and remember, keep track of things. But when you run a sprint remotely, you're either working in a Miro board, or we actually just created a brand new comprehensive Coda document for the 5-day design sprint. So you can run a sprint in a Coda doc, and as you're working, you're creating this real-time record of the work that you're doing, of the ideas that you're contributing, of the decisions that you're making. And so there's actually another ritual that we use internally, which is a biannual review where we look back at some of the decisions we made. And we look back at, well, what did we think of this company at the time versus how did it turn out, both in the negative and the positive, a company that turned out a lot better than we thought, or a company that turned out a lot worse than we thought. So I think it's a really good question. And it's super important if you actually want to get better and better at these things, is to keep the kinds of records and artifacts that you can actually look back and reflect on and compare yourself against.
So that's really a key, right? Like if you don't write it down, how can you trial and error on it? How can you learn from it? And then Claire, my curiosity for you is, how do you bring new people up to speed? Because I know that sometimes those records become like a fabulous mechanism for onboarding somebody into a group.
Yeah, I think that the biggest challenge and it's, good problems to have, but in a high growth environment is there's so many new folks, basically every week or every other week. And you want to integrate them as quickly as you can into understanding, the company, the business, and the culture and how you do things. In my experience, written artifacts are extremely useful. I think I find we produce so many that we need to actually curate. So we create packets for new leaders who are joining, especially of what we think are the most relevant things to read of recent sort of decisions or important overviews of the products or the business. The other thing that I'm a big advocate of is, again, sort of stealing from another industry here, but the medical school, see one, do one, teach one is, I think, having people shadow. I don't care what level you are when you join, but we have something at Stripe called Spin Up Buddies, which are people who are like your buddy to help you get up to speed on the company. And we have that for leaders as well as they have someone sort of outside their org to be a person they can ask questions of, or sort of, how does this work at this company, sort of feeling like a safe place. But I think that as much as you can have someone shadow a bunch of sessions of ways you do things, and then you reverse shadow them if you can make that time. I think it's hard. Time is precious. And then soon enough, they're going to be teaching on their own because that's just the nature of growth. But really being intentional about onboarding and spin up in the first few months when someone's at a company, that they're getting a sense of how things are done. But also I hope that they feel comfortable suggesting improvements, because it's easy to be nostalgic and think you've solved everything, but there's always room for improvement. And that's, I guess that's another theme, which is being unafraid to stop the presses and say, we must be able to do some of these things better, especially if the company looks very different. 6 months, in 6 months, you can have an entirely different animal. And if you don't recognize that, you're going to get that. I once worked in consulting, and we were in a training about slide making, and someone had written a title on a slide, "The Calcification of Suboptimal Processes." And in the training, of course, the goal was to write in plain English and not use words like that. But I often, in the back of my mind, think, oh my gosh, I'm seeing the calcification of suboptimal processes. And the same thing can happen to meetings.
So last quick question for me, and then we'll go into audience Q&A on that exact topic. Wade, I know you have a story about how you decalcified one of your less effective meetings by using the records that you had. Can you share that with us quickly?
Shoot. How did we do that? So, I think, I think it comes back to kind of what we did at the beginning, is like we had, a couple problems with it. Like we had not great agendas. We had not great decision-making tools. We leaned on status updates. It wasn't clear what the etiquette was about who talks when and how. And, I think the group sort of recognized like, hey, this is not working great for us. And so, we just got a bunch of feedback on like some ideas and just started testing and trying and iterating over time. That's kind of how we've landed on the mechanisms that we have today around, pre-written docs with read time at the top of the hour for folks to meet, the sort of red, yellow, green check-ins so we can get a sense of where people are at, comments in the sidebar, core topics happening in the key meeting, and then, a strong moderator to make sure that loud voices don't dominate the topic. I think that's one thing I haven't talked about much today is we have a moderator who's not me, sort of make sure to tee up voices for the topic so that everyone has a chance to say their 2 cents on a particular thing. And, folks can pass if they don't have anything to add. They can say, I don't have anything to add, but it really makes sure that we get the wisdom of everybody in the room, even those voices who are maybe a little bit predisposed to being quiet, and we don't accidentally, the louder voices, perhaps myself, don't accidentally dominate too much of the discussion, and instead we get the collective wisdom on everyone. So I think that's kind of what comes to mind for, us in terms of decalcifying meetings.
So love this. I love this decalcification sort of metaphor. Sounds very brittle bone, but also quite lovely. So we have a question from the audience that is on this exact topic, right? About getting past the loud voices. And the question is, how do we reduce the number of meetings enough that we have time to actually do the pre-work? Now, Claire, you had a tip about pre-work you've already shared. Do you want to just reinforce this one and maybe address it to this question specifically?
Yeah, no, I think Wade and I both mentioned making time in the meeting for doing some of the pre-work, at least the pre-reading, so that people aren't really, having to block 2 hours for something. They can have the time in the meeting and trying to run the meeting with a certain set of time for that, as well as the other agenda items. I think just having a very intentional agenda also. One thing that to reduce the number of meetings, I think I was talking around this a little bit, and it sounds like Wade did this with his company, but having a meeting audit, and that to me involves really opening up the environment for people to say, this just doesn't feel like a productive use of my time. So surveying people, asking the participants in meetings, like, what's the purpose of this meeting? Is it effectively meeting this purpose? Could we try to do this differently, asynchronously? I mean, we had a metrics review meeting that a lot of people sat through at Stripe that was really more of an updates meeting. And we've just started to send out the deck and the information that basically links to dashboards with some commentary now. And then we'll have a meeting if we need to, if something's off. But taking the time at least once a year, but maybe really every 6 months to reset on regular meetings, because they calcify, they sit there on your calendar, and then people sort of start to find them less useful over time, in my experience.
Yeah, that's the great thing about meetings, right? You want them to be predictable, but you don't want them to be boring. They don't want them to become a bad habit. John, you look like you had a thought here.
Yeah, sorry to jump in. I was just going to say, as you're doing that audit and considering, is this meeting needed? There's a couple of triggers that I like to look for. One is is the subject emotional? You can, I think intuitively we understand that, if you're having a difficult conversation with somebody about performance or, just a sort of fraught decision, you want to talk it out. You want to be face to face. You want to have that meeting. I think the other case is, where you really need that high bandwidth collaboration. And this is sort of the trigger, the prompt for sprints, the sprints that we run. And so I think, if you see a lot of meetings that don't fit one of those two triggers, they're not sort of an emotional topic, or they don't require high bandwidth collaboration. They're really just for accountability, or they're just, sharing information, or kind of, getting some nominal sign off. That's a pretty clear indication that meeting, it probably isn't necessary and should be replaced with some other type of process.
That's great advice. And for anybody who's looking for it, we developed a Coda doc that is explicitly a meeting culture audit. So you might want to check that out to help with this particular question as well. So do any of you, another question from the audience, do any of you have regular reviews of your meetings? Does the meeting, where you look at, does the meeting still serve the right purpose, or whether you should change things, etc.? Does anybody have this on their calendar? You talked about a biannual cadence for that. Yeah. Is that actually scheduled?
I actually review my meetings generally on a biannual cadence, and I survey the participants, or I say to them in our next one-on-one, if it's my team meeting, please give me feedback on how this could improve or whether we need to change our team meeting. At Stripe, we tend to do a reset as each year starts, because our sort of calendar year is our fiscal year, is our planning year. And we sort of look at the plans for the year and think about our structures, which I think is pretty healthy if you're evolving quickly. I don't know, Wade, do you have a calendar?
Yeah, we don't do it company-wide. I do something similar to you, Claire, where I do it on my own. Well, not necessarily on my own. I actually do it in collaboration with my EA. If you have that can be a useful tool. Not everyone has that though, but her and I will sit down and just go over, hey, these are this is what my priorities are. This is what's important to me. And I also know about myself. I'm the type of person that will say yes too much. And so, I work with her to make sure that we create enough time for stuff, and that I, don't accidentally say yes in a place that's going to prevent me from getting something done that's actually really, really important. And there's some other blunt instruments we've used over time and had some success with. For example, there was a time where I said, look, I don't want to be in any more than 20 hours of meetings a week. So like, that's the line. We're just not going to cross that. And if it's less, if it sort of goes below that, then that's okay. Like, I just need more time to do other things than to be in more meetings in a given week, especially when things like recruiting become really important. Like if you're recruiting for a high pressure role, you often need a lot of time on your schedule. And you need flexibility to meet candidates at a particular point in time. So I find like, some of these blunt instruments around just saying like, hey, I'm not going to put more than X on my calendar ends up as like a really useful but blunt tool to make sure you don't overload your time and that you really commit to the things that are actually the most important. And your calendar doesn't get like overwhelmed with things that are like good, interesting maybe, but ultimately not core to your strategy. So anyway, I do that review with my EA as a sort of helpful thought partner.
Okay, so we have like 2 minutes left, basically, which means that we get to wrap up with our final thoughts. You have shared a lot of fabulous, very, very specific tips and some broad general guidance. Now we've got people in the audience and in their companies who have not done any of this work yet. They're building their teams from the first time, or they're working in a culture that's got a terrible bad habit. I would love to hear from each of you your last final piece of advice. If somebody's just starting to look at their meetings, where would you have them start? We're going to go John, Claire, and then Wade.
Well, Wade used the phrase blunt instrument, which I love. And I have one to share that I use. And to be frank, I don't literally use this, but it's more like a thought exercise. It's a thinking tool, which is I sort of push myself and I push the teams that I work with to consider whether a meeting, basically there's only two kinds of meetings that are allowed. Is it a 15-minute meeting or is it an all-day meeting? Okay, so it's obviously a ridiculous continuum. And again, I don't do this literally, but I think there's something really healthy about this idea of, is this just a conversation, a quick conversation that we need because it's, we need the FaceTime, we need to connect, whatever? Or is this a really deliberate, intentional working session where we're going to have a structured process that we're going to follow? We're going to use this as an opportunity to really make progress on something. So that's sort of my final thought is, as you're reviewing meetings, there are only two options. It can be a 15-minute meeting or a day-long working session, and figure out which of those categories you fit into.
Nice. Claire.
Okay, I'll cheat and say two thoughts. One, Wade already did, but I think a time audit of your time, your team's time, your company's time is really worthwhile. If you look at your strategy and your priorities and then where the time is going, you usually can find some opportunities for improvement. The second is really, if you can, call bankruptcy and try to have a week or two with nothing and see what happens. See what people miss, see what people need. And do, I guess, to steal from the Ariana Huffington keynote, do a reset. And I think that takes some courage and some support from the top, but you could do it at smaller scales or larger scales. But I think it will reveal a lot.
Beautiful. All right, we're over, but Wade, super fast last thought.
Yeah. So I think oftentimes, you have a particular set of priorities and strategies that are what you actually think they should be. But the reality, what your priorities really are, is what your calendar looks like. And so I think doing just a, compare and contrast between what you think your priorities actually are versus where you actually spend your time will give you a lot of insight into, are you on the right track, or do you need to make bigger adjustments to make sure that you're actually driving forward the key priorities you have, the key strategies you think are most important. So compare what you sort of wrote down in a document to what your calendar actually looks like. And you'll know if you're spending your time wisely.
That's super awesome, because that's it, right? Meetings are where the action is. Where's your action? Take a look, make it better. Thank you so much for your fabulous ideas and your input. It's been a great time talking with you all.
Thanks, Elise.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.